September 18, 1939. A small Polish patrol crouches behind a bush near a quiet crossroads outside the village of Pocheka. The vehicle they're hiding isn't really a tank at all, not by any conventional definition. It's barely large enough for two men, low enough to hide behind a hedge, and light enough that a determined soldier could almost push it uphill by hand. Its commander hears engines in the distance, then tracks, then the unmistakable rumble of German armor rolling closer, unaware that anyone is watching. Within minutes, one of the finest tanks in the German arsenal will be burning, destroyed by a machine so small that German crews would later give it a nickname meant as an insult, one the Poles would wear as a badge of honor instead. This is the story of the TKS Tankette, one of the smallest armored fighting vehicles fielded by any nation during the Second World War, and the story of how a handful of these tiny machines, outgunned and outnumbered on paper, still managed to bloody some of Germany's most advanced tanks in the opening days of the invasion of Poland. It is also, in its own way, a story about what happens when a nation, without the industrial capacity to build a modern armored force, still finds a way to make the most of what it has, and about one crew commander who turned a machine built primarily for scouting into a genuine tank killer through nothing more than nerve, terrain, and precise timing. To understand how something this small ended up on a battlefield facing down German panzers at all, you have to go back to the specific, difficult position Poland found itself in during the interwar years. Having only regained independence in 1918, after more than a century under foreign partition, Poland entered the 1920s and 1930s with an economy and industrial base that lagged far behind its larger, more established neighbors. Building a modern armored force from scratch, the way Germany, France, or the Soviet Union were doing, required an industrial capacity and budget that simply wasn't available to Polish military planners of the period. And yet Poland's military leadership understood, with growing urgency as the 1930s progressed, that some form of mechanized reconnaissance and anti-tank capability was going to be essential if the country was ever forced to defend itself against a larger, better-equipped neighbor. This urgency only intensified as the decade wore on, and the true scale of German rearmament became increasingly difficult to ignore. Polish intelligence services tracked German tank production and doctrine closely throughout the 1930s, and by the time war finally arrived in September 1939, Polish military planners understood clearly that they faced an enemy with vastly superior industrial capacity and a rapidly modernizing armored force. The Tankette program, whatever its individual limitations, represented Poland's best available answer to a problem the country simply did not have the resources to solve any other way. The solution Polish engineers arrived at was a category of vehicle called the tankette, a concept originally pioneered in Britain that Poland adapted and refined more extensively than almost any other nation. Rather than building expensive, heavily armored tanks in small numbers, Polish designers reasoned that a large fleet of small, cheap, fast reconnaissance vehicles could provide genuine tactical value at a fraction of the cost, screening infantry formations, scouting enemy positions, and providing mobile machine gun support across a battlefield that Polish planners expected to be fluid and fast-moving. The TK3 and its improved successor, the TKS, became the backbone of this approach, going into production through the early and mid-1930s in numbers that, whatever their individual limitations, gave Polish forces a genuinely mobile reconnaissance element that few other European armies of comparable size could match. Poland's decision to invest so heavily in this class of vehicle reflected a clear-eyed assessment of its own limitations rather than any illusion about matching German or Soviet armored strength directly. A single TKS cost a fraction of what a proper medium tank required in materials, skilled labor, and specialized components, all of which remained in short supply across Polish industry throughout the 1930s. By fielding hundreds of these smaller vehicles instead of a much smaller number of heavier tanks, Poland's factories were never realistically going to produce in sufficient quantity. Polish military planners hoped to achieve at least a baseline level of mechanized capability across the army as a whole, even if any individual vehicle would struggle badly against genuinely modern enemy armor in a direct confrontation. It was, in essence, a calculated bet that quantity and mobility might partially compensate for a quality gap that Poland's industrial base simply could not close in the time available before a likely German or Soviet invasion. By 1939, several hundred TK3 and TKS Tankettes had entered Polish service, forming one of the largest fleets of light reconnaissance vehicles fielded by any European power at the outbreak of war, even if the vast majority carried nothing more than a single machine gun and stood little chance against serious enemy armor. The TKS in its original form was armed with nothing more than a single machine gun, adequate for its intended reconnaissance role, but essentially useless against enemy armor. By the mid-1930s, however, Polish military engineers had grown increasingly alarmed by intelligence reports describing the pace of German tank development, and a small number of TKS Tankettes were selected for an upgrade program intended to give at least some portion of the fleet genuine anti-tank capability. Engineers removed the machine gun and installed a Polish-designed 20mm autocannon in its place, a weapon originally developed for aircraft use and adapted for the cramped confines of the Tankette's fighting compartment. This was a serious engineering challenge in its own right. The TKS's turretless fighting compartment had never been designed around a weapon this size, and fitting the 20mm cannon required careful redesign of the mounting and sighting systems to work within a space barely large enough for the two crewmen already inside. The finished conversion could fire armor-piercing rounds from 5-round magazines at a rate fast enough to put multiple hits on a target within a couple of seconds, a genuinely useful rate of fire against a stationary or slow-moving target, provided the tiny vehicle could get into position without being seen first. Fewer than 30 of these upgraded 20mm TKS Tankettes were completed before the German invasion began in September 1939, making them a rare and precious resource scattered thinly across Polish defensive formations rather than concentrated in any single dedicated anti-tank unit. The choice of a 20mm autocannon rather than a larger, more conventional anti-tank gun was itself dictated almost entirely by the Tankette's tiny dimensions. A larger caliber weapon, while offering greater penetration against enemy armor, would have demanded a larger breech, heavier recoil-absorbing mounts, and considerably more space for ammunition storage than the TKS's cramped hull could realistically accommodate. The 20mm cannon represented close to the practical upper limit of what could be squeezed into the vehicle without a complete redesign of the hull itself. And even at this modest caliber, its armor-piercing rounds proved capable of penetrating the thinner side and rear armor found on contemporary light and medium tanks, provided the shot was placed correctly and struck at a reasonably favorable angle. This single design compromise, choosing the largest gun that could physically fit rather than the largest gun that would theoretically be most effective, would prove decisive in shaping exactly how Polish crews needed to fight these vehicles once war actually arrived. The Tankette itself weighed a little over 2.5 tons, dwarfed by essentially every tank fielded by any major power during the war. Its armor, at its thickest point, measured only about 8 millimeters, sufficient to stop rifle-caliber small arms fire, but offering no meaningful protection against tank cannon fire of any kind. Its crew of 2 sat almost shoulder to shoulder inside a compartment with no turret at all, meaning the entire vehicle had to be physically aimed at a target by turning the hull itself, a serious tactical limitation that demanded a crew capable of positioning the vehicle with precision under pressure. What the TKS lacked in armor and firepower flexibility, though, it made up for in size and concealment. A vehicle this small could hide behind a hedge, a low wall, or even a modest pile of brush, presenting a target so difficult to spot that German gunners repeatedly struggled to locate it, even after it had already opened fire on them. Mobility was another area where the Tankette's small size paid genuine dividends. Powered by a modest four-cylinder engine producing roughly 42 horsepower, the TKS could reach speeds of around 40 kilometers per hour on roads, respectable for a vehicle of its era and class, while its lightweight allowed it to cross soft or uneven ground that would have bogged down a heavier tank entirely. This combination of speed and light ground pressure meant Polish tankette crews could reposition rapidly between engagements, exploiting terrain that German armor, however individually more powerful, often found considerably more difficult to navigate at speed. Section Commander Edmund Orlik led a small detachment of these tankettes on that September morning near Pocheka, and what happened next would become one of the most remarkable small unit engagements of the entire Polish campaign. Hearing the approach of German armor, Orlik positioned his 20mm armed TKS in concealment overlooking the crossroads, holding his two machine-gun-armed tankettes back, since he understood clearly that their weapons would do nothing against enemy tanks. His driver forced the small vehicle off the road entirely, pushing through undergrowth to reach a position where a low hedge would mask the tankette's already minimal silhouette almost completely from the approaching Germans. When the German patrol rolled into view, unaware they were being watched, Orlik had a clear shot at the lead vehicle, a Panzer IV commanded by Victor Albrecht von Ratibor, heir to a noble German family and commander of one of the most capable tanks in the entire German invasion force. The German patrol was proceeding cautiously, hatches closed, but with no recent reports of Polish forces in the immediate area, there was little reason for the crew to expect an ambush at what appeared to be an entirely quiet rural crossroads. Orlik fired a single round into the turret side. It punched straight through. Smoke poured from the hatches as surviving crew members scrambled clear, leaving their badly wounded commander trapped inside, and a second Polish tankette waiting nearby immediately opened fire on the fleeing crewmen with its machine gun. The engagement was far from over. Two additional German tanks, lighter Panzer 35 Thesis, originally built in Czechoslovakia and absorbed into German service following the annexation of that country, rolled into view behind the burning wreck of the Panzer IV and immediately began searching for whatever had fired on them. Struggling to locate the tiny, low-profile tankette hidden in the foliage, the German crews fired blind into the tree line, shells tearing through branches and throwing dirt into the air around Orlik's position without finding their mark. Orlik held his ground, reloading and firing repeatedly at the nearest panzer's hull, where the armor was thinner than the heavily sloped turret front, until a round finally found its way through and detonated the tank's stored ammunition in a violent chain reaction that blew the hatches open in a column of fire. The third German tank, seeing both of its companions destroyed within minutes and still unable to spot the source of the attack, made the decision to break off entirely and retreat toward the nearby village to summon reinforcements, firing wildly into the surrounding brush as it withdrew. Orlik refused to let it escape, ordering his driver to pursue through the trees until they caught the fleeing tank from behind and disabled it with a final volley to its rear armor. If you're finding this one interesting, a quick subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like it. Now let's put the TKS side by side with the tanks it actually fought, because the numbers make Orlik's engagement even more remarkable. The Panzer IV, even in its earliest wartime variants, weighed close to 18 tons, more than 6 times the weight of the tankette that destroyed one. Its frontal armor measured up to 30 millimeters, and it carried a crew of 5, along with a short-barreled cannon designed primarily for infantry support fire. The Panzer 35T, somewhat lighter at around 10.5 tons, still carried armor up to 25 millimeters thick and mounted a 37mm main gun considerably more powerful than anything the TKS carried. On paper, in a straightforward engagement between these vehicles, the outcome should never have been in doubt. The TKS possessed a fraction of the armor, a fraction of the weight, and a weapon meaningfully smaller than either German tank's main gun. What the Tankette possessed instead was concealment, a low profile that made it extraordinarily difficult to spot and target in return, and a commander skilled enough to exploit that advantage at exactly the right moment, striking vulnerable side and rear armor rather than attempting to challenge either German tank's stronger frontal protection directly. The height difference alone tells much of the story. A Panzer IV stood well over 2.5 meters tall, presenting a target easily visible across open ground and even through moderate vegetation. The TKS, by contrast, stood barely 1.33 meters off the ground, low enough to disappear almost entirely behind a modest hedge or a gentle rise in terrain that would do nothing to conceal a full-size tank. This dramatic difference in visual profile meant that in the kind of broken, semi-wooded terrain common across much of the Polish countryside, a TKS could realistically approach to within a very short distance of an enemy tank column without being detected at all, a tactical advantage that no amount of German armor thickness or gun caliber could fully compensate for once the element of surprise had been established. This is precisely the tactical logic that had shaped the TKS's original design philosophy, even if its creators had never specifically envisioned tank versus tank combat when the vehicle was first conceived. A tankette built around concealment and mobility rather than armor and firepower could still achieve results against much larger vehicles, provided its crew used ambush and terrain to negate the enemy's advantages in size and gunpowder rather than attempting to fight on equal terms in the open. Orlik's engagement at Pocheka stands as close to a perfect demonstration of exactly this principle in practice. German soldiers who encountered these tankettes during the campaign reportedly began referring to them with a derisive nickname, comparing the small, hard-to-kill vehicles scurrying through the underbrush to cockroaches, difficult to spot and surprisingly hard to eliminate. There was a certain grudging respect buried inside the insult, an acknowledgement from German crews that these tiny, seemingly harmless vehicles had proven far more dangerous and far harder to eliminate than their size suggested they had any right to be. Polish crews, rather than taking offense, adopted the nickname with genuine pride, and it stuck as an informal badge of honor among tankette crews for the remainder of the campaign, a small but telling detail about how quickly reputation could shift on a battlefield where expectations had just been thoroughly upended. Orlik's success at Pocheka was not an isolated incident. The following day, he took part in a determined defense of the nearby town of Sieraków, where Polish forces destroyed 7 additional German armored vehicles in continued fighting, cementing Orlik's reputation as one of the most effective armored commanders Poland fielded during the entire September campaign. Despite skill and courage of this caliber shown repeatedly across Polish units throughout the invasion, no amount of individual tactical brilliance could offset the overwhelming disparity in numbers, equipment, and air power that Germany brought to bear. Poland's defense, however determined, could not hold indefinitely against forces so thoroughly superior in scale, and the campaign ended in defeat within weeks. The broader Polish campaign of September 1939 remains, in the decades since, frequently misremembered as a one-sided rout in which an outdated Polish military simply collapsed before overwhelming German technology. Engagements like the one at Pocheka complicate that narrative considerably. Polish forces, working with equipment that was, in many cases, genuinely outdated or underproduced relative to what the situation demanded, still managed to inflict real, documented losses on German armor through skill, terrain use, and sheer determination whenever circumstances allowed it. The tankette crews scattered across the Polish countryside in September 1939 were rarely given the equipment their bravery deserved, but the losses they managed to inflict on some of Germany's best available armor stand as a genuine testament to what determined, well-led crews could accomplish even in a fundamentally lost cause. Orlik himself continued fighting even after the formal defense of Poland collapsed, participating in the defense of Warsaw before eventually joining the Polish resistance movement following the country's surrender. Captured at some point during the occupation, he managed to escape and survived the remainder of the war. He was later awarded Poland's Cross of Valor in recognition of his actions during the September campaign, and is widely credited today as Poland's first tank ace of the Second World War, a distinction earned in a vehicle that most military observers of the era would never have considered capable of destroying a tank at all. The TKS Tankette itself never became a war-winning weapon in any conventional sense. Poland's defeat in 1939 was never in serious doubt given the scale of forces arrayed against it, and the Tankette's tiny size and thin armor made it fundamentally unsuited for anything resembling a fair fight against the increasingly heavy armor fielded by Germany as the war progressed. Poland's remaining tankettes, along with the rest of its shattered pre-war military, were largely lost or captured by the campaign's end, and the vehicle never saw further significant development or production once the country fell under occupation. But its brief combat record during those first desperate weeks of September 1939 demonstrated something that would remain true throughout the rest of the war and in conflicts long afterward: that a small, well-concealed vehicle in the hands of a skilled and determined crew could still inflict genuine losses on a far superior enemy force, provided it fought on its own terms rather than the enemy's. Edmund Orlik and his tiny tankette proved that lesson in the most direct way possible, in a quiet crossroads outside a Polish village against a German nobleman commanding one of the finest tanks his nation had ever built. Orlik passed away on the 8th of April 1982, decades after trading his tankette for a career as an architect in post-war Poland. But the story of the day his cockroach of a tank humbled a German giant remains one of the most remarkable small unit engagements of the entire Second World War. A reminder that in armored warfare, as in so many other forms of combat, the size of a machine has never been the only thing that determines who walks away from the fight. If you want more stories about the smallest, strangest, and most unlikely war machines that punched far above their weight, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.